Hi there, how's it going? Great to see you all. Thanks for joining us today. In case you don't know where you are at a Queer Chaplain podcast. And today we are on our Faith Leaders series, so Faith Leaders 2020. And I'm really excited about our guests. Our guests are out of Milwaukee. They are a happily married couple. So I'm really excited to have them on the show. They run an amazing church in Milwaukee that, like, don't tell my normal church, but I go there more since shelter in place than I do my my home church. So I really love what they're doing. I've never heard church the way I hear it there, and it just really speaks to me, and I love it. And so I'm excited to have an opportunity to let other people get to know these two as well. So I'm not going to belabor this too much. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests. And our guests today, I want to go ahead and invite Jonah and Cameron.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's a real joy to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. This is a new venture for me, which I'm excited about, anxious about, all that fun stuff,
I love it. We're starters of new things. That's like kind of our jam. So we've got your back. We're supporting you over here.
All right, fantastic. Well, I always like to start a little bit by I like to hear about people's childhood a little bit and kind of what their experience was with religion or church. So maybe you could share a bit about each of yours if you'd like, even if there's just like a story, maybe how it's different or similar now than it was then, whatever kind of stands out to you would be great.
Yeah, I can start. I was really lucky. I grew up in a pretty progressive and really religious household, which I know is very rare even now. But it's especially was rare in the 80s when I was born. I was born in 1987. And my dad was my dad still is a Lutheran pastor in the ELCA.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the most progressive mainline denominations. But even within that, he was educated by some progressive feminists and queer people. And he had queer people and queer religious leaders in his life that he loved even before I was born. So one of my godmothers is a queer pastor and was closeted in the 80s when I was born. But I had the privilege of growing up with queer religious leaders in my life. And for me, that was just such a game changer. I mean, to know not only that queer people were loved, but that queer people could bring the love of God into people's lives and were blessed to be, ordained leaders of the church. That was never a question for me when I was really little. On the other hand, as I grew up, some of those more traditional spaces didn't really speak to me culturally, didn't resonate with me. I went through my own struggles. I had some childhood trauma that I processed in some really harmful ways as an adolescent. And so I was an IV heroin user and had left the church and just really, was struggling with my trauma. And it didn't feel like the church that I was involved with at the time that I grew up with really had a lot to say about it or could really connect with me in that. So I left the church. And then when I did find my way back, my own process of addiction and substance abuse and healing brought me into communities with other people in recovery who were seeking after, spiritual depth. And for me, I knew that finding my home again in the Christian tradition and specifically a relationship with Jesus was going to be fundamental to my health and healing. But I found that among some really conservative evangelicals. And it was such a mixed bag because I had this beautiful blessing of connection to God and connection to community. The Holy Spirit was really alive in the worship there, but the teachings were really toxic and really harmful and actually drove me back into the closet. I had been kind of discovering my queerness around sexuality and gender as an adolescent. And by the time I was 19, 20 in these evangelical circles, I was like, whoop, back in. So, and I wasn't really about theology. And I was like, God loves queer people and there's nothing wrong with being queer, but I'm not one of, So I think that was really shaping me in my 20s. And it wasn't until I found my way kind of out of those spaces and into queer-led church that I actually truly started to understand fully who I was and what it meant for God to love not other queer people, but queer people, including me. And that was a real kind of back and forth. But I feel so lucky that I had that foundation when I was little, to lean back on. And it's one of my passions now, is to create space for children to grow up in, that the love of God for queer and trans people is a given.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing. I don't think I'd ever seen a queer person in my life, let alone in church, until I was like an adult. I really related to the comment you said about like realizing you were a queer and being like, oh no, I didn't want to be one or whatever. I had that same, like some of my favorite people were drug addicts and alcoholics who were in recovery. And when I found myself as an addict, I was like, oh no, like I have all these, like, I just didn't even realize I had all these judgments or these things like, oh, well, you can be that, but not me. And I was like, whoa, what's going on here, girl?
Yeah.
How about you, Cameron?
Yeah, my story is very different from Jonah's. I grew up in that kind of evangelical Christian toxic land, and so I was a closeted kid who literally feared other LGBTQ folk because I knew in my heart that I was one. And also I was told every time we talked about sexuality that it was so wrong, that I feared my own self. And so, I grew up in the church. We were always in church. I loved being in church. I loved Jesus with my whole heart. And also I had all of these questions that no one could really answer with good answers, because when it got complicated, all of a sudden people kept saying things like, well, it's clear in the Bible. Go read that. It's so clear. And I'm like, this doesn't feel clear. And so I think I was always one of those like rebellious kids who was asking all these questions that nobody could answer. And one of those that I knew for myself was about my sexuality, but also more about my gender. And so when I got to college, I myself found myself in a lot of also destructive places. I too have a little bit of childhood trauma stuff, and so I needed to cope with that. And so similarly, I got into drugs and alcohol to help me cope, and that took me further away from the church, not closer. And eventually found myself kind of looking in the mirror being like, where did you go? And also like, who are you? And I think that it wasn't until, even years after that I truly started to open myself up to that question of like, who are you? And that person is very queer and is super, super trans. And I've known this forever and ever. And I cannot stand not being who I am. But what that did was really put me in this competition with my faith, with Jesus. And at every step of the way, I knew Jesus was there. I knew Jesus was real. I had these experiences that were only for me could be explained by the unexplainable God. And yet people kept telling me that couldn't have been real because of who I was. And so I was lucky to find some really incredible folks who said, hey, you actually can be a gay Christian. So like, let's talk about that. And also, if that isn't who you are, that's cool too. But like, let's just talk about this. And I was like, oh, finally, someone who's willing to just explore my doubts, explore my questions. And that totally shifted who I am, who I love. Well, it didn't shift who I love. It shifted my ability to be in those relationships. But like, it shifted so much of like even how I see Jesus. Because I knew I knew Jesus was there, and I knew exactly who I was. And now I can confidently say, so did Jesus, and Jesus loves that. And so, yeah, it took me a lot of unlearning a lot of toxic things, which wasn't just, you can't be a gay Christian, but it was mostly like, you can't question. You can't actually like be mad at God. You can't have these you can't have these questions that no one can answer. So I am very excited to have to be able to do the church that we do now at Zao with someone I love, and we both get to be trans as crap, and we get to be queer as crap, and we get to ask those questions, create community who absolutely is just seeking after Jesus, and that Jesus helps us be more and more ourselves, not less and less.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious to know a little bit more about your church. It's like at least I don't think of Milwaukee as like a place where I would find, an interracial trans couple running a Jesus church. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, did you see yourselves there too?
No, so I'm originally from Chicago. You and I actually met in Chicago, but Cameron and I met in Milwaukee. And, it was just, I usually tell this story with a little bit more softness now, but if you had asked me in the first year or so of being in Milwaukee why I was there, my answer would always be because stupid Jesus, stupid made me. And it was this weird thing of like this clear calling from God, pathways kind of like lining up. And I wasn't sure either. I was coming to Milwaukee as an out queer and trans, genderqueer, radical leftist, but like heavily evangelically influenced charismatic Christian. And I thought that was kind of a crazy project to begin with, but I thought I was going to be doing it in Chicago. And I was like, well, Chicago's a big enough place. I'll find the other people. And then Jesus brought me to Milwaukee, and I was like, how in the world is this going to work here? But it does. And the people of Milwaukee are incredible. And it turns out that like everyone's gay everywhere. And there are trans people like dripping from the ceilings, and everyone is longing for meaning. And some of those people longing for meaning want to find that meaning in spiritual, explicitly spiritual or religious or even Christian spaces. And so I have just been blown away at the fact that like there are people everywhere that can form incredible community. And now that I know Milwaukee better, I'm not shocked that it's here, because Milwaukee is an incredible city with incredible people in it, a lot of creative folks and artists, and just people really following the spirit, I believe. But it does give me hope that you really can do life-changing community anywhere when you can be bold and find other people who are bold enough to create the sorts of communities that they actually long for, not the ones that they're willing to settle for or think are the highest bar that they can even dream of.
Yeah.
I never thought either that I would be here. I mean, to be frank, when I graduated college, I decided to like go into full-time ministry because I felt really called to that. Now this was pre coming out and all those things. And so I moved to Milwaukee to do ministry. But while I was doing ministry, I kind of had that revelation of like, I can't keep lying to myself about who I am. And I came out and was promptly fired by the ministry that I was with. And they, it was terrible. But essentially I was kind of left alone to fend for myself with one person who had no community here. And I went, well, what the heck, God? Because I thought I was coming to Milwaukee to do ministry. And that was really the time that I almost left church completely, because I was like, I thought I had gotten my crap together because, I stopped drinking. I stopped doing drugs. I got my life together. I'm going into ministry for you. And then this is what happens.
Yeah.
Anyway, but like, I think that that's why I say, like, I have seen God do incredible things in my life. And it is clear, if there are things that are clear, one of the clear things was that ministry was supposed to be a part of my life. And that supposed to be a part of my life also includes my queer and trans self. And so for me, I never imagined doing Zao. I imagined doing some sort of ministry, but it was clear that this was part of the cool plan, I think, that God has for us.
It's so exciting when like all this like seems to be random shit just kind of like comes together in a way, and you're like, oh my God, this does not make any sense at all, but it makes so much sense. Like just so much sense. Yeah.
It's hard, you know, but it's like, once you get to look back and kind of see how all those pieces were hard and didn't make any sense, and then when they click together, and for me, every time we get together at Zao, like, COVID really hurts my heart, because every time we get together at Zao in our building with, you know, people together, all who like love justice and they love Jesus, or they are questioning the heck out of Jesus and what all of this means, but they want a deep community who stands for something. And I get to stand in front of that church and do ministry with these people. Like, wow, right? Like that, it's just this wow thing that like I get to be a part of this. So it's really cool.
That's so awesome. I love your energy about it all. You can tell it's just like it's in you. And how has, you talked a little bit about how COVID has impacted church for you all. What are some strategies? I guess what are some new things that you've been doing to kind of like I guess cope with that?
Yeah, so I really like this thing called the Enneagram, and I'm an 8, so I'm really like, let's tear down systems and all these things. And also, apparently, there's like this 5-ness where you go and you just learn everything. That is what I feel like I have done to cope with COVID, which is to just learn everything, which has been really, I think, helpful for Zao, because we are on StreamYard, and I was like, hey, I know what StreamYard is because I've researched it. And, I think that we've taken all of our services online. We do everything online. We feel like that is a piece of justice for us, to make sure that the most vulnerable are safe. And so we were, in Milwaukee anyway, one of the first organizations that just kind of shut it all down, because we believe it's a justice issue. And so I immediately started to research everything that you possibly would need to know to stream services online. And, because of some really amazing people, we got a little bit of money to be able to get some equipment to make us run really well. We have some amazing people in our community who are creative and wonderful, who make videos and know how to do lighting. And that's the beauty of running queer churches. Like, we got all the theater folks. Yes. So we are going to look good while we do this. And so, I have just learned everything I possibly could to make sure that we are continuing to have community every single week, even if we are far apart. One of the most fun things for me is Sunday, watching comments, hearing people again have some questions and be talking back and forth to one another, and really engaging with the sermon that Jonah is always preaching on something really cool, and hopefully enjoying music that me and my awesome band put out. So we're continuing that connection.
That's one of my favorite things is your worship service, like such amazing music. I love the kind of word changes and choices that you all make. It's just amazing, and beautiful voices that are part of the choir. It's one of my favorites. And one of the things that I like is that I miss a lot in church, which was not something I grew up with, is communion. And I know communion can seem like a really I mean, there's a you're in community, right? So how are you guys approaching communion?
Yeah, communion is so critical. And I think it's a really interesting practice for me because Jesus instructs us in the scriptures to do it every time we gather. And there are some people who do it less often to hold it more sacred. But for me, my interpretation of that is like, really do it every time you gather. And I think that there's something so mystical about the communion experience that I've never been able to explain. I mean, like, I've had people come up to me in tears after taking communion for the first time in a long time or for the first time ever, often because there is a sense of belonging when you come to the table and when you say, I'm a part of this. I'm a part of this family. I'm a part of this community. I'm a part of this meal. And we practice something called open table, which is a part of our tradition that says that no one is barred from the communion table, that all are welcome, that it's not up to us to tell anyone anything that they need to do or say or think or believe, that we truly believe that God has welcomed all people to the communion table. And I think that having that shared experience of knowing that you are truly invited and that you belong to something that is so ancient and holy and present in the moment just has this really meaningful impact on people. And so when we went virtual, one of the first questions that came up was, what do we do with that? I mean, how do
you mail wafers?
Yeah, right. And so I think that there were some communities that hold some theological beliefs about communion that require it to be in person. So there were some people, some communities I know of for sure who would like get their elements and bless them and then like somehow deliver them to people or whatever. And that's just not my theology. I think that what God does with that meal is among people. I think that the Holy Spirit is wild and powerful and present, and that she's not restricted by distance or technology. And personally, I don't think that she has a particular preference for bread and wine. So even though those are things that were contextually important and present in Jesus's meal, there's a long history of, for instance, rice being used in parts of Asia where bread is just not as common. And what it really is the substances that keep us nourished and bring us joy. So after a lot of conversations and reflection, we decided we were going to do communion regularly. And at first, we were kind of breaking up our services. I mean, at the very beginning of COVID, we wanted to be able to have a touch point with people every day because, routines were being so disrupted and people were suddenly out of work, or people who had been looking for work for a long time were suddenly without hope, or, whatever. And so I think people feeling so isolated, we just broke up our service. And so we had like the sermon on Sunday along with some other elements. And then we had like Music Monday was this like night of worship music. And then Table Tuesday was when we practiced communion and other rituals. But pretty quickly, people wanted it incorporated back into the service. And so now weekly we do communion, and we invite people to grab the elements that are available to them, the food, the drink that brings them nourishment and life. And one of my favorite things on Sunday mornings is just like hearing people list all the different elements that they have, and sometimes it is bread and wine. And Taylor is mentioning in comments that that favorite is Fireball and Snickers bars. And you know what? If those are the ways, right? And if that can be a celebratory, connecting, holy meal, then is that really any different or more ludicrous than to think of the holy meal as bread and wine? I think that opening that up to say that like God really does meet us in whoever we are and whatever brings us life. And the communion table is just one more manifestation of that willingness that God has to like show up for us, not on God's terms, but on ours, or at least in the ways that we're most available and ready to receive God's love. God will show up.
Yeah, I think that's so, I mean, for me, I feel like accessibility is so important, and it feels like there's always these like created walls that for people, for just people who aren't clergy or whatever, to access God, it's like you have to go through all these channels. I understand, and I have like I guess I have like a respect for why we have those sorts of things, but I also want to challenge it too. And that was one of the things I loved about when I met you at Urban Village Church, is that, I could like wear my little hot pants to church and, help serve communion, and that was just, it was just magic, to be able to exist as who I am now and just like hang out with Jesus too. What the fuck? Like,
Exactly.
it's awesome.
It's how it should be. It really is. And knowing Jesus should open up more of who we are, not close it down or make us feel ashamed or hide it away or compartmentalize. And it's really the brokenness of the church and our own projected shame on one another that does that. I don't believe that's of God. And I think that when we give God the freedom to really to love us, then actually it does. It opens us up to come to communion in whatever makes us feel good that day, and to be able to put really out there for the world exactly who God made us to be. And I wish more people would be able to show up to the communion table as a recipient or as someone blessing others with giving, with more freedom of expressing who God made them to be.
Indeed. And you guys are such a radical, badass church. I'm sure that some people maybe don't like you. I had heard I saw you had a series called Hate Mail. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I thought that was just really smart.
I thought so too. That was not my idea.
It was mine. No, so part of what we've been doing, part of our cornerstones, I guess, we are Jesus rooted, justice centered, and radically inclusive. And so I think people come to Zao for a lot of different ways, or for a lot of different reasons. But one reason that really seems to bring a lot of folks in is our care for justice, right? So this summer, Black Lives Matter has been around, but for some reason, this season really brought to the forefront, I think George Floyd brought to the forefront, but I'll still, say names like Breonna Taylor, etc. But George Floyd, everybody was in the streets yelling Black Lives Matter. I think some people for the first time, which is really, really excellent and good to see that people's shifts, people's ideas and philosophies are kind of shifting towards justice the way that they should be. But so Zao was in the streets and we we're lucky to have a lot of partners who helped us know where best we could be useful in the streets. And so one of the things that we ended up doing is helping create what we at this point just call the depot. And this started in literally someone's backyard, and the organizers in Milwaukee who were, running the street organizing said, we want to march for 200 days. And, so Zao was like, okay, how do we help? Like, what is our role? What can we do? And people started saying, hey, I have this excess amount of stuff. Can we just like store it at Zao? Hey, I have too many sandwiches. Can I like drop those off at Zao? And so things just started to kind of pile up at Zao. And by the end of the summer, we were just basically known as the depot, right?
And it's like a supply drop and distribution center. So we have not had a building for very long where a church starts. So we started in my living room like a couple years ago. And at the beginning of this summer, at the beginning of COVID, we had 5 months of worship in this new, beautiful, massive, traditional church building that we had kind of snuck our way into. That's a different story. But we had this big building, and we were really quick to shut down in COVID to protect the most vulnerable members of our community. And so we were really lamenting that and saying, why would God give us this incredible resource at this time where we aren't able to use it? And then this opportunity appeared. We first actually opened our doors as a sanctuary space. We were part of kind of an underground network of safe houses for protesters in the streets who might come into conflict with the police, who needed a safe place to go. But as Cameron mentioned, it just sort of kind of spiraled in the best way from there. And what folks may not know about protracted movement activity and street protests is that there are a lot of material needs that go into that. When people are out there marching for days or weeks or months on end, they need regular access to water and food and basic medical care, and some of that has to be coordinated behind the scenes. And so we felt so honored to be able to coordinate with this informal network, this kind of supply chain that had developed across the city, and then centralize it at the church. And so over the course of the summer, Zao became known as the place to go if you needed anything to make your protest happen. And so, we've been able to coordinate everything from thousands of bottles of water to generators and tents. And we have this whole network of community activists who have been doing this work. And I think where Cameron was leading with this, we get hyped about the depot and we want to talk about it. And
right. No, it's good stuff.
Well, and we're really proud of that work. But some of it became really public, and we got some media attention for it. And then all of a sudden it really attracted attention from folks across the country who were very angry that a church was participating in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was when we started to receive hate mail and death threats and threats to the church building and things like that. So we were pretty prepared. Go ahead.
Who were the threats coming from?
They were anonymous, but area codes were coming from as far away as Texas. But
it was Christian folk.
Yeah, self-identified Christian folks saying,
handwritten letters.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That we were shaming God, that we were a fake church, that we were terrorists.
False prophets.
Oh, that one was a lot. There was a lot of that one.
Yeah.
Burn in hell, go to hell.
My favorites were when they would call us lukewarm. I was like, you can accuse us of a lot of things, but being lukewarm is not one of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it got really, really wild for a time. There were times where we had to kind of make sure we were not on site so that we could remain safe during specific windows that we had been threatened to, be harmed. And during that time, we were receiving a lot of hate mail, and we had to check all of those to see if any of them were credible threats. So we were reading like volumes and volumes of hate mail. And it was really interesting because some of it was funny and silly and ironic. There were some people who, for instance, would say like, a church shouldn't be so political. Trump 2020.
Yeah. That's not political.
Yeah. So we would kind of laugh about those, but there were other ones that brought up really, really rich conversations between us. Yeah. There was a woman who was really talking about how she believed that Jesus taught us to be obedient to the law, and that Jesus, following the example of Jesus meant never breaking the law. And I was talking to Cameron about how ironic it is that, that a man executed by the police in public to be made an example of not opposing the government was being held up as a reason to always obey the government. And so we got to talking about it, and Cameron was like, why are we not doing this as a series? There's so much complicated theology and so many undertones here. We could just turn this into a sermon series and just highlight some of the themes that are coming up in our hate mail, and really go through this publicly and have sort of a conversation publicly rather than us just kind of doing this behind closed doors. And it really resonated with people. I think some of it was people just enjoying that we were being kind of tongue in cheek and we were taking our haters on. Taylor is commenting that, one of our, there was a lot of spelling errors in some of these. So we were called Satin worshipers.
Yeah.
And there were some
Not
other,
that.
other amusing.
I like a good satin.
Yeah. But
Right.
but yeah, we put that publicly and really turned it into a rich conversation.
Yeah.
I don't think that's new for us. I mean, that amount of hate at one time is definitely not a normal thing. But I don't think that when you have a two queer and trans pastors, that you're ever gonna find a huge amount of people who just like, oh yes, they're following Jesus, because I think the majority of the Christian American kind of white Christianity would say that this is just not possible. So it's not something that we're not used to, by having to deal with all the people like that. So
yeah, well, and Jesus was total badass. I mean, Jesus was always like bucking up against church people mostly. I mean, that, at least in my understanding, and that's the cool thing that I love. I don't, it's like, I feel very late to the game. I'm a little embarrassed to say, but like, I've just haven't had opportunities to like think about even just stories in the Bible differently, like where I grew up, it was never talked about. Like, there's obviously people of color in the Bible. There's obviously like, you recently did it this last weekend, you were talking about, and I'm such a horrible, I think it was Rahab.
Yeah,
right? Rahab. Yeah, and so she's like a prostitute, right? And that's how people would say it. But you were able to like, you just brought on this like empowerment, like sex work, like it was just so like awesome to hear that. And I've heard like the Ethiopian eunuch as a Black trans woman in today's time, and like it's just been really interesting just to kind of hear stories of old as if they were like from a lens of now. It's been really exciting to hear.
I'm so glad that stuff has resonated with you. And I think I'm really passionate about it. I'm actually in January going to be launching a podcast called Jonah and the Peacock, doing precisely that work of like in a podcast format, really dissecting some of the biblical stories from a very different lens. Because one of the things that I love the Bible. I love the Bible so much. And it's really strange to a lot of people how much I love the Bible, because I have been, attacked by people beating me with the Bible like my whole life for who I am. And so, there are a lot of folks who would assume that I don't like the Bible, but I think that the reason that the Bible has been harmful is because we've got only a tiny sliver of the vast beauty of God's humanity reading and interpreting the Bible. And those folks in power who are doing that are doing it toward their own benefit at the cost of others. And that's been happening for generations and generations. It's something that we all need to be careful of. Like, I need to be careful not to only read the Bible to my benefit. But I have learned very quickly that, like, I read something and I'm like, oh, those two people are hella gay. And then I find out, like, oh, no, David and Jonathan, they were just like really, really, really good friends. I'm like, they are making out and weeping over each other. Like, why can't you just accept that they're in love? And to me, there are things that when I come with my queerness or I come with my transness to the Bible, are so obvious. And I think that, I have had the enormous privilege of being able to collaborate with other brilliant people with different identities who come as people of color to the text, come as people with disabilities to the text, come, with all of these rich experiences that make those stories really different than the way that they were told to me. And I think that when we can bring our creative imagination that prioritizes who God has created us to be, rather than that tiny, narrow, restrictive lens we were given when we were first handed, our first ever kids' Bible, I think that the text can have so much more meaning. So it's something I'm really, really passionate about. And we've done a lot of series at Zao. One of my favorites was called Sunday School Horror Stories, where we took all of these. I actually really wanted to call it fucked up stories from the Bible that we keep telling to children because they feature animals.
I nixed that.
It was a little long.
Right. It was just too long. That was all. Yeah.
but it's true. We tell kids these stories from the Bible that are like massively screwed up. And our interpretations only make them worse.
And
and we're like,
traumatizing.
it's fine that God committed genocide because animals 2 by 2, and so just trying to like reapproach that and say like, well, what, if our first assumption is that God is good, and then our second and third and fourth assumptions are queerness and transness and the power of people of color and resistance and marginalized experiences being beautiful, like how does that change the nature of those stories? And so yeah, that's my favorite thing to do, and it's really woven into they let me talk once a week at Zao, so talk about what I like.
Well, and it's all there. It's all there. It's not like you're making up shit. It's just like you're actually like just like, no, really think about it. Like think about it. And it's I don't know, it's like I said, it's kind of like it was kind of embarrassing, but it's also like, for me, it's also kind of exciting to get to hear and see things a little bit differently, to see myself in it, to see the people that I love and care about also in it. It's just so powerful. And I struggle with saying I'm a Christian, but I do love me some Jesus shit, and I do love me some Bible stories. Like I still get stuff from it, even if I don't know what to do with it most of the time. But anywho,
I would say that you're one of the best evangelists I know, because you're real with people about that, and I think it's so much more inviting to say, I don't know if there's a God, or I don't know how I feel about Christianity, or I believe different things yesterday than today, but here's what I'm doing, and here's what I'm pursuing, and here's what I'm open to, and here's how it's changed me and blessed me. And like, what are you doing? And do you want to be, in this with me in some kind of way? I think is the most pure kind of invitation towards deeper spirituality. So I'm with you.
Yeah. Well, I've got to a point in my life where I just can't not, like my transness, my trans experience is completely a gift from God, and it's been birthed and come to life because of my relationship with God, or my deeper seeking. Once I realized I could have God like in my life again, like it was just like, it's what I was looking for all the time, and those drugs and alcohol that I felt like I had to turn to instead of, when I lost God and church and, all that stuff.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. I just like, that is my desire, like my desire for everyone to feel exactly what you just said, which is like, my transness, that's how I feel. My transness has brought me closer to God, but getting closer to God has made me more trans, and like how awesome that is to like be in this big loving connection with the creator who created this awesome gift of transness that I have. And going back to what you were saying, being able to see that in the Bible. I actually preached on the Ethiopian eunuch a couple sermon series ago to say, like, this is a Black trans person, and I am Black and trans. Do you know how cool it is to see myself in the Bible? And y'all need to see myself in the Bible too, because when you don't have me around, a Black trans person, you don't have the wholeness of what God has created, and you miss the Ethiopian eunuch in the Bible because of it. You like, and so we need each other. We need to be in community with one another so that all those experiences show up with God in the Bible as we are community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the other thing that's really important too is that folks are not, so like these people that are in the Bible, they were there all the time. They existed as they always have. But I think it's also like important for people to see those people, if you will, also in the world and living like godly lives, if you will, even if they don't label it that way, but living as if they, I don't know, they don't believe the world is out to get them, and that they have a purpose in being here, and part of who they are is why, I don't know. I don't know where I was going with all that, but.
Well, no, I think that's a really good point because it's hard to do, right? Like when you're a marginalized person, it's very hard to walk this world. And it took me a while to have the understanding that like my transness is a gift from God, right? And so like it's hard to do that. And it was absolutely like YouTube was amazing for me to be able to see and go on YouTube and see other trans folks just talking about their transness, right? Because we aren't as represented in the greater population or in media like we should be, and all those things. And so I think it's hard when you feel isolated and you feel like the other, to be able to get to that point that says all of this is a gift from God. So it's hard to do.
Yeah, because the world is telling us everything else.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, I think, go ahead, Jonah.
Well, I was just going to say that the stories that are getting out there are also primarily the stories of pain and rejection. And like, it is so important to name the pain and hurt and suffering and oppression of queer and trans people. And I never want to take away from that for a moment. And also, it is really important to tell the stories of joy and transformation and love among queer and trans people. And I think that that's part of what we do. You know, every Trans Day of Visibility and every, you know, birthday and Saturday. I mean, like Cameron and I are a little bit gross about how often we post on social about how in love we are. And I think part of that is just because we're gross and that's who we are. But part of that is that, you know, we've had conversations about how important it is to see that you can be trans and in love. You can be trans and loved. You can be trans and in love and in public ministry. That like, you know, being able to see yourself in the world matters. And, you know, I alluded to this before, but like, I didn't come out of the closet even to myself as a trans person until I met queer people running churches as an adult. Like young queer people who were introducing me to religious trans people. Like I needed all of that, even with my lucky, wonderful upbringing. Like I needed to see that that you could be queer and trans and religious and leading and in love and like have a really good life. I needed all of that because, you know, the first thing that I remember, even having queer adults in my life as a child, the first thing I remember thinking when I remember being like in middle school on a field trip and realizing that I was attracted to one of my friends and being terrified about it. And the reason I was terrified was because I thought I can't be queer because it's so hard. That's just going to make my life really, really hard. And I think that that's, you know, in some ways true because the world is hard, especially for marginalized people. But like, my life is awesome. And like, it would be so much worse if I had stayed closeted. And I could not be the full person I am if I wasn't queer and trans. And for me, if I wasn't queer and trans and out. And I think that like, being able to represent that you can have a full and beautiful life that's more full and more beautiful for your queerness and transness, it just matters. It matters.
Yeah, I mean, we owe it to our trans sisters. We owe it to the people who came before us, who suffered more and differently. I mean, we gotta like own it and be like, hell yeah, thank you. And I hope that the people after us, you know, they get to experience more joy and less different struggle. We'll say different struggle. You know, so that we can. So I don't know, just so that it's all like worthwhile. Like I have to remind myself that sometimes too. It's like you fucking like, but that's part of the problem is like when you know your history, it's easier to know where you're at and where you're not, and you can have gratitude for what you have, even if it's not what you want, so to speak, or dream of yet. But yeah, we are running out of time. I wanted to give you an opportunity to share anything else that you two are working on or that you would like other folks to know about.
Yeah, so I'll just, since we never really did the rundown, I will give just a little spiel about Zao. Zao MKE Church is a young and growing church plant, started in Milwaukee on my couch, but now fully online. And one of the enormous blessings of the pandemic is that we do have members in California, in like all up and down the West Coast. We have members in Texas and in Maine. We have somebody who tunes in regularly from Germany. So I think being able to be online has given us just this incredible space to connect people. And so if folks want to drop in, you always can. We stream live from our Facebook every Sunday morning at 10 Central Time.
Soon to be on YouTube as well, because I'm learning more things.
Yeah, so and we have like online community small groups and things like that. So there are ways, if folks want to get connected with Zao MKE Church as a church, you absolutely can. And as to your point, you don't even have to leave any other church that you are a part of to do that.
Right.
We work with folks who have kind of multiple affiliations and things like that. So if you want to experience church, or even just kind of like, dip your toe in and see what church is like when it's led exclusively by queer and trans people, you can definitely check that out. And our identity, Cameron mentioned it, we're Jesus rooted, justice centered, and radically inclusive. And for us, that means that like Jesus does kind of lead the way. We're really explicitly Jesus forward, and we really don't use the word Christian a whole lot because of the baggage, but we talk about Jesus a lot. And when we see Jesus in the scriptures, we see a brown-skinned Palestinian Jewish peasant who organized and pushed back against the Roman Empire, and that informs everything we do. And so from that, we have this kind of central tenet of justice, and we prioritize work of justice and the seeking of justice in the life of our faith to lead us toward that radically inclusive community where all are truly valued and welcomed and appreciated and celebrated for who God has made them to be. So yeah, if anybody wants to kind of check that out and see what we're about, we'd love to have you in whatever capacity is meaningful to you. And I think we're really excited because even once we are able to worship in person, which we are thrilled to be able to do at some point in the future, we will be online in some capacity forever because our community is bigger than Milwaukee now.
Right.
So that's one thing. Do you want to talk about the Liberation Project?
Sure. Yeah. Technically, we are a United Methodist church. And so we have had the amazing opportunity to connect with other churches who are in the same mindset of Zao. I think we talk about liberation, which means, I'm not free until you're free, and you're not actually free until I myself am free. And so we talk about this liberation. And so we just started this new project called the Liberation Project. It's with it has been formed with us and a couple other really important both pastor and lay folk who have come together to say, like, we're all United Methodist people, but how do we make sure that we're talking about liberation? Because I don't think we talk about liberation that often in church space, even though Jesus the liberator came to earth, right? So like we want to talk about liberation and what that looks like in each context, because it does look different depending on where you are. And so part of what you heard earlier is Jonah will be starting a podcast called Jonah and the Peacock. I will be doing music. I'm starting like a creative collective. My hope is that I would have like visual artists and musicians and anybody who wants to talk about creativity within our churches, so that if we had liberation at mind, what would our songs look like? What art would we hang on our walls? What would our actual worship service look like if we thought about liberation? And then there's just a bunch of other really cool people who are a part of what we're doing that will be putting out things like blog posts and Instagram posts, just to try again to talk about what does liberation mean in our context. So I'm really excited about the Liberation Project.
And most of those
Awesome.
folks are queer identified.
And people of color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
Fantastic.
a really exciting project. And if you wanted to find out more about that, you can search the Liberation Project. Our website is theliberationists.com.
Okay.
Um,
And I'll include like all the links to everything with all the videos. This will land on a YouTube channel called A Queer Chaplain, along with a bunch of other interviews with drag queens and trans folks and other faith leaders, as well as on a podcast. So anywhere people listen to podcasts, you can listen to this interview here, or this conversation. Interview sounds so formal, but as well as some of the others. And I'll be sure to include ways to get connected with you all. Wherever they start hearing your voice, I'll make sure they know how to connect with you.
Awesome.
Thanks so much. And you have probably a library then of your previous sermons and worship, all that sort of stuff is living somewhere.
Yeah. So all of our virtual worship is available on YouTube or in like the videos tab on our Facebook. We've also isolated just the sermons, and we've been podcasting those actually for years. So you can go back pretty far with that. And for that, you just, wherever you can find podcasts, you search for Zao MKE Church.
And if you happen to not find that, you can go to our website, which is just www.zaomke.org, and there's a tab that has like our sermons on it as well.
Fantastic. How about your music? Is that available separate?
It is not. Some of that is on. We used to do this thing called Music Monday when COVID started. So you could find like some Music Monday, which would be on our Facebook. But that is something that I am currently trying to make sure we get on YouTube so that people would be able to have access to some of the songs. It's that whole like, is it okay to have on YouTube and Facebook and stream things and all those, but somehow it'll be on YouTube and we'll get it to you. So I like changing up words and lyrics a little bit to make it more inclusive and to be the fullness of who I am, at least, and make sure that we have music out there that's like that. So
awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. And I cannot say enough how grateful I am for you to be here, and so grateful that you two are in the world and you're doing the badass stuff that you're doing. I cannot say enough. And folks, if you do yourself a favor, find a way to connect with these folks, because it's just going to be a really good choice. We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. You all have a good night. And thanks for everyone who tuned in and hung out with us this evening. I have like a little outro that I'm going to play. And we will call this a conversation ended. Here we go.